So, just that before we get cracking onto today's agenda, I have to advertise. So there's three things up there. The first one is the systems engineering workshops, which are being held in Adelaide, I think. So 1st and 2nd of November. It's a bit late, but hopefully some of you are already booked and going. Our particular working group is going to be doing some workshops there about defining the value proposition of systems engineering for transport. So that'll be an interesting one. The second bit there is on the 27th of November is the National Speakers something, which is essentially a Caesar Run event, which I'm going to be talking actually about lessons learned applying systems engineering in transport. So we'll be doing it here, and then there'll be a feed across the country so people can listen in. And for 2019, we're still running some events and stuff. Keep an eye out on LinkedIn and those type of things for the events coming. And SETI obviously is coming in Canberra as well. The date is to be disclosed. All right, so today we're very lucky to have with us Nick. And Nick started his career working as a human factors advisor in rail and road. Today his creative business, Opposite, provides specialist support for major infrastructure projects. He also applies user-centered design approaches to improve culture, engagement, and simplify workplaces using applied psychology. So today the topic is psychology workshops, and we please welcome Dr Nicolas Duck.
Thanks, John. So today the topic is the psychology of workshops, and I'm a psychologist, so there will be some psychology. I hope that is pleasing to everyone. So I'll try and make it as practical as possible, but certainly do expect a bit of psychology. So I thought I'd start by talking about one of the first workshops that I ran about at the start of my career, my real job, my first office job, and that was I was working in a government department. And I was asked to organise this workshop for some SMEs to come in and provide some advice. And anyway, so I rocked up and I had, a few things sort of prepared, and it was only a 2-hour session. And my manager at the time got really sort of anxious and sort of, worried, and I was like, what's going on? And apparently I'd broken this cardinal sin. I hadn't actually prepared an agenda. So I hadn't actually printed off this piece of paper, and put it all together. So we got through it. It wasn't a big deal. It was only a 2-hour session. And we then proceeded to follow a process which I've seen very common in a lot of workshops, which is let's put something up on a projector. And in many cases, it's putting up like a big Word table or a big Excel table. And while people talk, let's record, what people are saying and pop it up there on the screen. And one of the things I remember very clearly was that we spent all this time, playing around with formatting, copying and pasting things around, people saying, you move that row up here and move things around. And, I walked away thinking to myself, there's got to be a better way of doing this. I mean, you've got all these really great people in the room together, so surely we can actually harness the knowledge in that room in a more effective way than simply playing around with word tables and printing off agendas. So let's talk a little bit about workshops. The first thing I was thinking about when I was asked to prepare something on this was, what is a workshop exactly? Because originally a workshop, probably didn't look as, photographic as this, but, they used to be a bit like this. They were places where people went and actually built stuff. So before factories came along, workshops, that's where you did things. Somehow along the way, like business does, it adopted this term, workshop, and I figure that the reason they've done this is because people are trying to say, and myself included, that if we're going to bring all these people together, we want it to be really practical, you're going to get some really good outputs here. Now, in some situations, I think we call things what we want them to be, not what they actually are. So we've probably had many experiences together where the workshop has actually been not very practical, where people have gone around in circles discussing things, where there perhaps been some conflict and we haven't been able to resolve things. So the question before we even get into workshops is, do you actually even want to run a workshop to begin with? Because quite often, more often than not, people kind of go, let's run a workshop. In fact, as a consultant, I get asked to run workshops more than anything else. It's almost like the go-to response when there's a problem. So the question is the workshop the most valuable use of time for everyone? Or is there actually another method you could actually follow that's more effective? So before we even get into what a workshop is, can you actually do something else? Now, I'm going to assume that if you've come to the psychology of workshops, you want to hear about workshops. So I'm going to pretend that we've decided we're going to run a workshop, and let's talk about how we can make that more effective. So I've learned a little bit over the years. One thing I learned was providing an agenda would be effective. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today is planning and purpose. So this is, maybe goes without saying to some people in the room. Having a really clear purpose about what you actually want will guide how effective the workshop's going to be. But it also dictates the exact process on how you're actually going to run the workshop as well. So working out exactly what you actually want to happen in that workshop will tell you how much time do I need to plan for this, who am I going to invite. I'm then going to talk about some other things that we don't often think about. It's the environment, like this lovely room here is quite nice, but quite often we say to ourselves, where are we going to hold this? Let's just go to meeting room 5 in the corner. We don't give it really that much thought. And lastly, I'm going to talk a bit about the personality and motivation of the people in the room. So there's going to be a bit of psychology throughout all of this, and hopefully we'll also learn a little bit about ourselves along the way, which is always good. So, setting the purpose. Okay, so if you're running a workshop, there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to run one, and I'm not sure how often people actually stop and think, what are we actually trying to do here? So the first thing you sort of think about is, are you trying to generate ideas? Are you actually bringing people in the room to actually open up the discussion and come up with some novel alternatives to something that you haven't tried before? Are you trying to test ideas? So in the context of, say, let's say a design, you might be saying, well, we're going to put a design up on the screen and we're going to talk about that. That's testing an idea. It might be a concept design, it might be a preliminary design. That's basically what you're doing, to saying, look, it hasn't been built yet, it's just an idea for now. It's up there, let's test it. In some situations, you might want to solve a really novel problem, and this is something I notice a lot that people get tied up in. They go to, sort of businesses, they call it business as usual. I know that's a term that's become kind of controversial, but people will talk about, old risks, this has never happened before, but in some situations you actually need to look at something that's novel and new, and in doing that follows a very different process to then solving something that's actually been solved before. You might also be seeking knowledge from the room. So you might actually be thinking to yourself, this has been done before, why don't we actually go to some people who've actually done it and get that knowledge, let's harvest that knowledge. You might form a workshop to make a decision, or you might form a workshop to simply execute something. So, broadly speaking, what you're trying to do is you might be trying to open up the discussion, or you might actually be trying to close it down. The next thing you might think about is, what does your environment look like? So, I'll give you 2 examples. This is a nice open environment, and here's an alternative. That's not the room from today, if you're thinking that. It's actually quite nice. But when you attend a workshop or you attend a meeting, you probably don't even stop to think about it. But the environment plays a huge role in how you actually feel. It also has an influence on how you think. It also has an influence on behaviour. So, as a bit of an activity, I'm going to bring up some kind of, initially, some quirky findings in psychology that's related to the card that's there in front of you. So pick up your card, and I'll talk about some things in the environment that have been shown to influence in sort of an unconscious and very subtle way your thinking. So we've got, everybody's got one of, I think, 5 cards. Does anyone have the briefcase? If you have, just hold it up. It's like an icon of a briefcase. I'm not going to put you on the spot or ask you any questions, so if you... Okay, keep your hand up, for those of you who have the briefcase. Keep it up if you think having business symbols actually prime cooperation. So in other words, people are more cooperative. That was good. I think there was follow the leader there. Andy, you put yours down first. Okay, so research has shown that using business symbolism actually primes competitiveness. So simply having objects in your environment that reminds people of business settings tends to prime people to behave in a more competitive way, behave in a more a way that relates to self-interest. How about the Apple logo? We've got the Apple logo there. Who's got that? Right, now keep your hand up if you think the Apple logo primes more creative thinking. So keep your hand up and put it down if you think the opposite. I like if I give everyone a little bit more time, they change their mind, I'm not sure. Okay, so those of you got your hands up, you're correct. Yes, it's been shown that relative to an IBM logo, Apple primes creativity. So objects that we associate commonly with creativity tend to prime more creative performance on a test that measures creativity. Okay, so some of you got a picture of like a nature or a forest. Pop that up in the air. Okay, so what actually? So, how many people think that nature also primes creativity? Right, okay, I like the way, I thought people would instinctively think that is correct. Yeah, so research has shown that nature actually relaxes people and actually opens up your thinking. Now, some of you have also got one that looks like a horizon. It looks like you're kind of going off into the distance. Yes, okay, so keep your hand up if you think having something that primes a sense of motion or moving forward, or a horizon, in other words, keeps people persevering longer at a task. So keep it up. Yes, that's correct. It does. Anything that primes people to think like they're moving forward helps them persevere longer at a task. What else have we got? We've got the flame. Yes, all right. So hands up if you got the flame. Okay, so keep your hand up if you think that the flame primes more aggressive behaviour or things associated with heat. Yes, that is correct as well. So things associated with heat. Interestingly, warmth tends to prime cooperation. And lastly, some of you have actually got green and others have got blue. So put your hand up if you've got blue. Okay, keep your hand up if you think blue primes creativity. Okay, yeah, so actually in studies shown that green does actually, just prior to performance on a task. The reason is that green is associated with growth, and anything associated with growth makes us kind of more expansive in our thinking. Right, so just in a nutshell, I know they're all kind of quirky, interesting things. You might be thinking, how do you apply this though, Nick? Come on, this psychology, it's all kind of quirky and interesting, but what do you actually do? There's actually a room that was built in Melbourne, and I'm not giving a plug because I work with these people, by the way. It's just something that happens to be there. But they actually designed a room specifically around research like this. And the idea is that if an organisation is actually seeking a little bit more of an edge with innovation, that they can host more workshops that actually are supposed to stimulate more creative thought in that environment. So it's not supposed to say that if you bring a whole heap of people who don't have ideas and put them in this room, all of a sudden they're going to have these eureka moments, they're going to have the new Apple or anything like that. All it's trying to say is that, there's lots of elements to what you're trying to achieve. The environment is one of those things to take seriously. In contrast, this room does not. At least I don't think it does. I'll have to find this room and see. I've run some tests. So in short, there's some more general findings about this that actually can apply in different ways. So obviously you don't have to use symbolism in order to prime thinking, but what's really important very fundamentally is that when you're running a workshop or actually any kind of activity in the workplace, having a sense of progress is really important. So let's say you're running a workshop and you're starting off and you're introducing a topic, you might like to say, especially if it's in a series of events, we've made a lot of progress to date, and actually talk about some of the achievements right at the beginning. As you're running the workshop, you also might want to talk about the progress you're making during the day, during the session. So what you've been able to achieve. The other thing as well is that you've got to be careful about how you prime the room. So it's very often, you've probably had these experiences, when I said before, we think about the people coming and we think about maybe the topic and the purpose, and then we say, oh, let's just go and go to meeting room 5, and it's that room without the window, and it's stuffy, and nobody really likes it that much. Careful how you actually organise the room, because it does have an influence on how we think and how we behave. And in particular, if you are trying to do something that's a bit more creative, a bit more open, you're coming up with new ideas, new products, new services, or you're just trying to test something that you haven't done before, really think about that. Think about that environment that people work in. All right, so the next part is actually about you guys. There's also a test. It's not really a test, but it's a little personality snapshot. Now, I'm giving you a disclaimer. This is all for a bit of fun. It's not actually, it is actually based on real research, but obviously a real psychological test you have to take over a long period of time. You shouldn't really be doing it in a big group like this. It's really just for a bit of fun. If you're interested afterwards, I can give you a link to the proper one. But what I'd like you to do is fill out this little card, and if you don't feel comfortable doing it, don't do it, of course. But it'll just give you a bit of an insight into some of the information I'm going to present next. So it'll only take you about 2 minutes. Basically, what you do is you put a score of, if you agree with any of the statements, you put a 7. So really agree, that is, it's like that's me. If you don't agree with it, you give it a 1. And you do that all the way through, and then at the end you subtract B from A. So score B from A. So I'll give you 2 minutes. I don't think you need much longer. Most people are getting pretty close. So I think I've given you the right instruction, but it doesn't matter either way. You're supposed to actually subtract B from A, not A from B, if that makes sense. A minus B. Yeah, A minus B, that's okay. So basically, if you get a negative score, it means the opposite, which is kind of fitting because my business is called Opposite. Okay, so how many people would still need a little bit of time? Anyone? Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about the first one there. So if you tended to get a high score for score A, which is around that E1, that first column, then and you tended to get a lower score for score B, that means you tend to be more extroverted. So how many people have heard the term, I guess you probably have, extrovert, right? It's pretty common usage. Extroverts, for those of you who don't know too much about it, and certainly from a psychologist's perspective as opposed to what's used in common terms, someone who's kind of generally more enthusiastic, they're kind of a bit more social, they get a lot of energy from being around other people. You know you're an introvert just instinctively if you're around people all day and you get home and you're wiped out. It's just like, being around people is exhausting. It doesn't mean you're not sociable if you're an introvert. It just means that you have different preferences. So why is that important? Well, I'll give you an example in a second. It's regarding Amazon. But it's because extroverts generally, if you're running a workshop, we probably all run workshops where you get one or two people who are kind of the noisiest people in the room. And I don't mean that in a negative way, it's noisy. They're generally the people who are very enthusiastic and want to offer their suggestions immediately. They're the sort of people who like to think out loud. Then there are people in the room who actually don't like to think out loud. They like to think about stuff first. They like to kind of internalise a little bit first. So if you're running a session when you kind of don't think about the process too much and you say, right, let's just open up the discussion, let's just brainstorm. This is a nightmare for an introvert because they actually want to think about stuff first before they talk. To give you an example, Amazon, I'm not sure if any of you heard recently, it was it's popular in the media recently, they've got a policy now, if they're running meetings, what they say is they print off a memo that's been prepared, they get everyone to sit down and read the memo before they even start talking, and they spend 30 minutes doing this. So they all basically get everyone on the same page, so no one can rock up and say, oh, I haven't read the memo, and have to sort of keep up with the conversation. But more importantly, everybody has the time to sort of digest that information, and then afterwards, they then have the discussion. So everybody's at the same starting point, and the introverts all have time to actually digest that information. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're running a workshop or organising one that you should suddenly flick to memo model and let's just copy Amazon. But what it might mean is that you give them time throughout the workshop to actually stop and think and reflect on things, because you're going to get much more out of the room by doing that. Some general rules when you're dealing with a combination of introverts and extroverts, and this works for extroverts also, can reflect and everything too, so it doesn't actually impair performance with an extrovert, and these are just simple practical things. The go-to strategy for running a workshop, if you haven't used it before or experienced it before, is get people to discuss a topic in pairs first before they contribute to the group. That immediately diffuses any tension in the room. People feel more likely to actually contribute. So rather than just keeping the conversation open-ended and allowing one or two people to contribute, discuss in pairs first. Opportunities to write down thoughts is also useful as well. So basically stop, allow people to kind of reflect for 5 minutes, and then let's have a discussion, and you'll be surprised at how many people actually start participating at that point. And the other thing to do is, as I mentioned earlier, you don't always necessarily need to obviously run a workshop. If you've got a situation where you think, there's a lot of people here who just generally are not really good in groups and talking, you can just actually go and talk to them one-on-one instead of actually organising that workshop. You can gather their feedback beforehand or offline. So not everything has to be gathered in that forum. All right, so what we've got here is it's actually the last one on your list, O. It's related to openness to experience. So if you've got a high score in that top quadrant there, that would generally mean you're more open. If you tend to get a high score in the bottom one there, that means that you're probably less open than other people, a bit more conventional. If you got somewhere in the middle, then obviously you're somewhere in the middle. So what does that mean exactly? Well, openness sounds like it's kind of a fun thing, because you're going to go open, you're creative, open to possibilities, open to experience. Sounds like they're all the people you want in the room. In some cases, that's a really good thing. In other cases, it can be a real nightmare for especially for an open person if you've got them attending many conventional kinds of meetings, or worse still, if you get your really open, creative person to run the same kind of workshop over and over and over again with the same formatted structure, it's like poison to them. You need people who are lower in openness to actually get on with stuff and get things done. One of the things to be mindful of, especially if you're organising a meeting or a workshop with that sort of open dimension, so when you're trying to open up the discussion, having someone who's really low in openness won't like that very much. More importantly, if you run a workshop and you don't even think about the purpose, you get an open person and a person who is less open together, then there's immediately going to be conflict, because the person who's open wants to discuss ideas. The person who's low in openness wants to kind of go, let's just get on with it, we've got decisions to make. But making that purpose extremely clear can be really important, and setting the scene. So, give you an example of something. This is, again, for the people who scored higher in openness in the room, you might look at this and go, oh, this looks like it'd be a fun, creative way of doing things. Someone who's low on openness would be going, what is this? Lego? You're kidding me, right? Some of the things that we've used previously is, some of you may have seen before, Lego Serious Play. It's basically using like big Lego sets and getting people to create their ideas in front of them. So it actually opens up the discussion around the creation as opposed to just going to some sort of conventional method. We've run workshops, most people kind of get this and they like it, but we certainly do have people who sit there and kind of go, I just don't get it, I don't know where this is going. Again, it's not necessarily bad or good, it's just demonstrating that some people have different preferences and it depends on what you're doing. You certainly might not want to necessarily use this in, say, an infrastructure design process. You might not want to go, here, let's build some Lego and create something. But to the open people in the room, you might think, why not? If you do that and you start, just creating, doesn't mean you have to build it, but it might actually generate some ideas you may have not noticed before. One of the benefits of having an approach like this, where you can actually look at, say, an object in the room, which is around testing ideas, is it also shifts the conversation away from the individuals in the room and their knowledge to a prop, which can be really effective as well. So all of a sudden you're having a conversation about this creation, as opposed to, who actually knows the most information. So, just general rules of thumb. Again, I'm imagining that not everybody has a handy Lego set in their booth that they can take off to a workshop and use. We do, which is handy, but we didn't always. So, what are some of the things you might want to do in a workshop where you want to either have an open discussion or close it down? You might want to just set the boundaries right at the beginning. So, let's say you're running a risk management workshop. Okay? Not everything in risk management, you have to be extremely creative sometimes because you've really got to think through what could go wrong. It may not always be a conventional risk, it might be something you've never even thought of before. I bet you that there's been plenty of incidents in the past that people would have said it just never happens, and then lo and behold it does actually happen. You actually do need an open discussion sometimes, but you've got to set those boundaries. There's nothing more annoying for people in the room if you've got if you've got basically a very open person who rocks up when they've already had lots of discussions about a topic or an issue, and there's been a lot of analysis already, and someone comes in and says, hey, why don't we do something different? Let's just open it up again. That's not the right time to do it. But if you're having a discussion about opening the discussion, opening up the ideas, then setting that at the start to say, look, we're actually going to be talking about looking at some of these novel risks. We're going to be looking for something that we perhaps haven't seen before. So we're going to take the time to actually think through that. One of the things you can do, instead of just saying we're going to do one or the other, is basically say, let's take some time to go over some of the stuff that some of the things that are a bit more abstract and harder to predict. And we'll set some time to do that first, and then we're going to go through some of those other things later. So to put the people who are lower in openness at ease. The other thing to do is, and this is another problem around a lot of people's assumptions about creativity, generally brainstorming, which people do quite often, is not a very effective way of generating new ideas. Brainstorming has this kind of exhausting feeling about it where you just keep generating ideas over and over and over. It never has an end. So quite often it's good to actually set your creative thinking around a real business problem. So you don't necessarily want to just have a free-for-all blue sky discussion. And once again, I can't stress the importance of that environment. So setting up an environment and the process to actually encourage creative thinking as opposed to stifling it. You're not going to have a lot of really creative discussions in a really stuffy room with no air and the permanent marker on the whiteboards and just generally a feeling of that you want to get out of that room as quickly as possible. All right, so. This is the one that always is, people don't like to have high scores in, but they shouldn't worry about it because it's actually, there's actually some real benefits that people don't often talk about, which is this, they call it neuroticism. It's a terrible term. More recently, my colleague has told me that the best term, it's actually emotionality, that's the term now, and I thought, that doesn't really sound much better, really, does it? But the idea behind this, so people who are higher in neuroticism, so that's the N there, is it's actually risk sensitivity. So it's actually being very, very attuned to things in the environment that could go wrong. So somebody who's very high on this is very attuned to, they're not risk takers, And you actually do want people with that kind of mentality. If everybody was really low in this, they would do all sorts of silly things all the time. They'd take all sorts of unfortunate risks. So high neuroticism is actually not necessarily a bad thing. Again, it's just like everything in personalities, it's different. People respond and act differently. But some of the things to think about is that people who are generally higher in neuroticism, so they tend to worry a bit more, they get upset a bit more easily than others, is generally speaking in a workshop setting, is that they're the people who are they're worrying about the social setting. So they're not even they're not able to even generate all of their ideas or even talk because they're thinking, I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to say something that everyone's going to look at me and think this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And I think we've all been in that situation. It also depends on your experience as well. If you're lower in experience, you're probably going to keep your mouth shut even more so. One of the things I often say to people is always say what you think if you've got a point to make, because you'd be surprised how many people are sitting around the room thinking the same thing until you actually say it. And you'll get people jumping on the bandwagon with you and saying, yeah, I agree, that is a bit strange. Why are we doing that? But as a facilitator or someone designing a workshop, one of the things you think about is how do you get a person who's generally going to worry about talking to actually talk? So it's a bit different from introversion. Introversion, they like to take a bit of time to think about it. Someone who worries a lot will probably have something to say, will think about it, and then will just sit on the topic, and then they might try and address it in a different way later. So what can you do? I'll give you an example. This is actually, you wouldn't believe this is a risk assessment, or a form of risk assessment that we did a while ago. This is for Vic Roads a long time ago. So basically the idea was we were looking at a risk assessment across the driver's journey, and then we summarised all of the different hazards and controls that are commonly associated with driving, and we got participants to get up and got on the board and just start mapping where all those risks actually fit in this format. The reason why it was I select methods like this sometimes is that it immediately takes the attention away from this sort of group setting where everyone's just talking to each other to a prop in the room where everybody can feel like they can participate. One of the other benefits of doing things like this is that unlike brainstorming and other approaches like that, where you've got this sort of endless list of things that you're up to row 55 in an Excel spreadsheet, or you're up to idea 55 in just on the whiteboard. When you set up an actual prop with some slots to fill, people start to feel that sense of progress that I mentioned earlier. So you're starting to actually put the building blocks there. When you get to the end of it, you go, all right, we've actually mapped all of this thing. I actually feel like we've done something today. It doesn't mean that you then just shut down the conversation. There might be some gaps. Where are the gaps? But importantly for dealing with the different personalities in the room, something like this neutralises a lot of the social dynamics that can sometimes impair people's performance in a social setting. So it helps for the introverts, helps for people who are generally more worried about sharing their views, and really importantly, it gets people out of their chairs and moving around. So in general, if you've got, and by the way, when I mentioned that we've got this personality assessment here, I don't want you all go away thinking, I've got to work out what personalities have I got in the room here. The truth is you're probably never going to work that out very well. You'll sometimes know this is an extrovert, or you might just know, right? But most of the time you're not going to know if someone's really worried. It could be the quietest person in the room who looks really relaxed and cool but is actually stressing out. All of these suggestions are designed around what you can do for any workshop. So it's not about do an assessment first and then apply the logic. This is basically good rules of thumb you can apply any time. So some of the things I would do is, design things around the prop. The other one is just simply design things around smaller working groups rather than one big open discussion. Again, you might think, it's their problem. If they don't want to talk, isn't that on them? But the question is, do you actually, if you've invited them and you think that they've got valuable information to provide, wouldn't you want to actually get that information as opposed to just relying on them to kind of build up the courage to actually talk? The other one as well is that good old agenda comes up again. I must admit, I'm a bit of a non-conformist with things like agendas because I like to surprise people. But I do recognise that the good old agenda says to people when they come into a room, I know what to expect. There's some certainty, so then people can kind of relax. You can, of course, run workshops and keep people on their toes a little bit too much and they feel very uncomfortable. So the Lego is actually a really good example of that. If you don't really explain why you're using it, people can look at it and go, gee, why have we got this Lego here? What are they going to get me to do today? That kind of thing. So obviously, it's up to you how you want to set your agenda. Of course, you don't have to follow a traditional format, but making very clear to people, this is what we're going to do today. I'm not going to put you on the spot. I'm not going to get you to do anything you're uncomfortable with, that sort of thing, so people feel comfortable. Right, now we're up to, this is an interesting one, because I don't think anyone's got a fantastic recipe for dealing with this situation, but you can get people who are, this is your A dimension here. So on the one hand, if you get a high score there, you tend to be a more agreeable person. If you get a high score on that score B there, you tend to be kind of more argumentative and have stronger opinions. Again, not an official personality test, it is actually based on a real thing, so don't worry if you're getting high scores on things you don't like. Seriously, don't stress about it, you'll be surprised what you might get on a proper test. And if you're somewhere in the middle, then you're neither disagreeable or agreeable. So what does that actually mean exactly? Well, what it means is if you all probably know agreeable people because you more often than in life you meet people who you're just really warm to because they're really friendly and they look after you and they take care of you, and it might be family members, it could be a good friend you've had for many years. That generally a person who is more accommodating to you, more polite and more concerned about your welfare is a very agreeable person. So nice people to know. People who are much more disagreeable, people who are not as concerned about making you happy and not as concerned about being polite. So they're kind of people who might sort of voice their opinions even if it means embarrassing or upsetting another person. Now again, that sounds like a really horrible thing. You sort of think to yourself, oh man, I hope do I really come across that way? Or you might think to yourself, yeah, I know a few disagreeable people in my life. But again, if let's say you're running a workshop or you're running a meeting or you're in any situation, you actually need a bit of both again, because sometimes you need the disagreeable person to actually tell you what you don't want to hear. So you could be, say, working on a design and you could be sort of nearing the end and somebody comes along and tells you, gives that feedback on something that you don't want to hear. Well, it may actually save you in the long run. Horrible to hear, but you had to hear it. The agreeable people are good allies, but you can have a situation where people are too agreeable and they just tell you what you want to hear. So, put a report together and they go, oh, it's fantastic. It's like, oh, I can't really learn from that, can I? So having a bit of disagreeableness is actually pretty good. Now, where this one comes into play and it's a bit more tricky is when you're running a session and you've got a more disagreeable person there, or maybe a couple. They might be arguing, or you might be arguing with them, or they might be trying to cause a bit of a stir in the room. I'll give you an idea first of all. Remember I mentioned before that you don't always need to run a workshop if you're in that situation. So just think of that. Get the ace up your sleeve. Sometimes people default and they think, let's run a workshop, let's get a meeting, let's get everyone in the room together, we'll sort it all out. If you're in a situation where you've got some very disagreeable people, having everyone together in the room can be, a complete disaster. So you can actually do other things. For example, if this was working, you could, instead of a workshop, we did for a client, you can probably see up there, a really interesting program where we thought, let's get people's ideas onto an ideas board and then get others to vote on it. So instead of it being, who's the noisiest voice, who's the most sort of vocal person, who's going to, really assert their stuff, let's take it offline, let's let people do it in their own time, let's capture those ideas. And then we took those ideas and we formed little working groups and they went off and executed them. You can probably see from all the comments up there, people are actually really interested in this idea and were participating. We've got much more engagement doing something like this than we would have in organising, say, just a workshop or a forum where everyone came along and actually contributed in the room. And in some cases it can be because you have a lot of really tricky personalities in the room. But again, you might say, that's all really well and good. For you, Mr. Management Consultant, you can come in and do a board like that. Where am I going to get a board like that? So there are some more practical things you can do. So some of the techniques that I would think about if you are, in fact, walking into a situation where you've got someone who's a bit more disagreeable, is that make sure you've got very clear limits about how much you're willing to compromise on a particular issue. The reason I say that is that it can be a very kind of emotional environment if you're dealing with someone who is not very polite. So having very clear criteria of how far you're willing to be pushed is very important. A good example could just be something as simple as like a contract negotiation, where you might go, this is the amount of money that I'm willing to sacrifice, as an example, and you know that in your head, being very clear about that before you walk into the negotiation. Otherwise you can get tripped up very easy, because a disagreeable person is not afraid to upset you. The other thing as well is, if you are in a situation where it's not really so much about conflict, it's more about you've got people in the room, you actually do want to get a good mix of negative and positive information, well, actually state that, actually at the start of the workshop, say, look, we're going to collect a lot of information about what's right, and we're also going to collect a lot of information about what's not working. And how often have you been to a meeting or a forum or a workshop where we actually just focus on all the negative things? We say, right, here's something we're testing, here's a design we're looking at, and everyone looks for all the problems that could go wrong in it, as opposed to saying, oh, but by the way, all these other things that we don't even sort of stop to think about actually work really well. And the other thing you can do is, if you, and I probably got a lot of this experience with teaching at university when I was running tutorials, I did that for a couple of years. There's always one person in the room who wants to basically have a debate, and it can really derail the discussion, and it can keep going. One of the things to do that's really important is don't get involved in a big debate with everyone. And it isn't because you necessarily you can't back up the debate. It's just wasting everyone's time. You can have that debate offline if you need to. So one of the things I'd suggest is, if somebody's got really unhappy about something, is just listen to what they have to say, take the information away, and then deal with it offline at another point in time. The last one on the list here is conscientiousness. That's the C. So high score in that top row there. You can tend to be a bit more self-disciplined. High score in the one underneath, disorganised, careless, tends to be a bit more relaxed, not as concerned about priorities. This is a kind of a fascinating one. Organisational psychologists like myself get really excited about their conscientiousness, because it's related to workplace performance. It's one of the most consistent predictors of workplace performance. It doesn't mean that if you get a low score in it, you're not going to perform. It just means that if you're a bit more dutiful and you get stuff done, lo and behold, surprise, you actually generally perform better at work. So what do we know about conscientiousness? Well, what you'll probably find is a person who's very conscientious, so almost perfectionistic, will be very uncomfortable if there are loose threads hanging, if things actually aren't closed off. So if you want to park a discussion or something, or move on and not actually resolve something, they won't like that. It's just kind of like, we're here to actually get this done and to actually close it off. Someone who's lower in conscientiousness might not worry as much about that kind of thing. They might just sort of think, yeah, we'll deal with it later. We'll work it out. Again, there's always the double-edged sword with personality. Some of the things I would say work for both individuals is that sense of progress again. So the sense of progress I mentioned right at the beginning, it's important for the environment that you're in, but it's also important when you've got both conscientious and less conscientious people. Why is that important? Because if you're really conscientious, getting constant reinforcements that you're actually are ticking things off makes it feel like, we're getting stuff done, we're actually finishing it off. I still work with people who love spreadsheets, and they'd be like, right, we'll get it done, we'll just get everything to a spreadsheet, and they feel fantastic once the spreadsheet was done and it was saved on their computer. It also works really well for lower and conscientious people, because people who take a bit longer to get going, usually it's better to carve things up into smaller chunks, and then they can start ticking things off slowly, and they get more motivated because they actually see a sense of progress as well. So that actually works for both. I always say that break more frequently than often. So workshops, there seems to be this kind of dry formula where we kind of go, let's have morning tea, let's have lunch, it's afternoon tea. There's no reason why you can't have a break every 20 minutes, depending on how you've actually structured it. There's no reason why you can't actually say, right, let's have 10 breaks, and let's just keep people's attention going by doing something like that. So don't always fall into that habit of thinking we've got to follow kind of the structure of how we like to eat. That doesn't necessarily mean breaks, right? And you probably know from just being at work that you often break more often than you realise. You go and get cups of tea, you turn around and have a chat with your colleague, you stop and you check your emails, do all those sorts of things. If emails considered a break, probably not. And the other thing as well is that you want to provide some sort of definitive end and not provide like too many loose threads. So that doesn't necessarily mean that everything has to be resolved, but you have to have a feeling that maybe something's captured at the end and it's going to be resolved. But leaving things kind of open-ended, people don't like that. And that's one of the reasons I don't particularly like brainstorming, because I feel like we could just brainstorm for the next 10 years and we'll probably still keep coming up with ideas. When do you actually call it quits? Just some other ideas that I didn't quite fit into that structure. I just thought they'd be interesting to think about. This is a little bit similar to the one that we've used previously when we did that hazard assessment for Vic Roads with the driver. But journey mapping has become pretty common now. But basically, I like using this because what it does is it provides a common language for everybody to look at. So you might think, what a journey map for what exactly? Well, you could almost quite literally use it for things like in a transport environment, which we've done, where we actually said, let's take, say, we're looking at, say, train stations, or we're looking at new technology. Let's look at a passenger journey from end to end, and let's look at every little interface along the way and understand what kind of impact do we have, what kind of impact are we having on them. So as an example, that's a nice stock photo, but we actually did ultimately develop something along that line, which actually turned into an analysis. So it's broken down into passenger journeys. It's really effective to have a common mental model or framework for everybody to look at, because a passenger journey is something everybody can relate to. So if you've got lots of different people in the room from different walks of life, having something that's common to all of them means that they can all kind of have a similar discussion, or they can actually talk to the same thing. But if you've invited people along to a workshop and you've got different levels of experience, people who are less experienced can get lost, and you actually don't get the best out of them. They might have some really good ideas. This one is probably not something that you want to try on your own if you haven't done something like this before, but I mentioned complex problem solving before. Sometimes problems aren't linear, so actually drawing the problem as it is in some sort of map, a recursive map where you've got arrows pointing things in different directions, can actually describe the problem more accurately. We use this in workplaces where an organisation has a particular complexity to their issue, and we want to actually uncover a root cause that's actually not that easy to detect just by having a conversation. And then ultimately that we turn it into things like this, where we can actually start picking out what element of that map has the biggest impact on solving the problem. So you can use it for pretty much anything. You can use it for incident management. You can even use it for say, why do we have low motivation in the workplace? You can sort of try and unpack. Don't try and understand exactly what I got there. Systems mapping, and probably have another presentation walking through the whole thing. The idea is that there are different approaches to solving novelty that don't necessarily follow the same approach that we might use for business as usual problems. So don't always go to the same thing you're comfortable with or the thing you've used previously. There are other approaches you can actually try. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about decision making, and then I was going to wrap up. So there's lots of biases that people are susceptible to. In fact, if you were to go off and Wikipedia unconscious bias, you'll see hundreds of things there, right? So I could again spend not just an hour presentation talking about biases. We could talk about this for a few weeks, and you probably left going, now I'm even more confused. I'm surrounded by biases. So I picked a few that are very, very common. The ones that I often come across in workplace settings, and it's something to be mindful about in your workshops, but also in your decision making and how you actually reach a decision. So one of the ones that comes up quite often, they call it the effort heuristic. It's kind of like an effort bias. So in other words, you see something has a lot of effort put into it, and therefore you assume that it must be of high quality. Now, in many cases, that actually is true. When you put more effort into something, it's better quality. But it does actually get to a point where having more pages and more appendices and more forms and all that kind of stuff doesn't actually add much to the quality. Sometimes it actually diminishes it, because you get a document like this and you go, actually, I'm not even going to read this thing now because it's way too long to actually digest that information. Effort heuristic is basically, I'm going to make a decision, I'm going to pick this one because it looks more complicated, it looks like a lot of work's been put into it, as opposed to going, well, what is it actually I'm trying to get out of this? Which option's actually best for me? Planning fallacy is, we're surrounded by this all the time. This is basically, we underestimate the time and the resources it takes to truly deliver something. And the reason I bring this up about workshops is that apparently people are more likely to, this is more pronounced in group environments. So people actually become more overconfident and make even more sort of outrageous sort of projections when they're working together. Because basically they build each other up. Someone says, "Oh yeah, we can do this," and then next thing you know, you've underestimated completely on time and cost. This is the number 3, their confirmation bias. I don't particularly like talking about this one because I kind of think it's obvious. We do seek what we look for things that we already know is true. So we've already made up our mind, and then we look for evidence to actually prove it as opposed to disconfirming evidence. And then you throw an agreeable person in there or a group of agreeable people all nodding saying, yeah, you're right, that's it, that's what the problem is. Confirmation bias has been known to be a big problem in science. People go off and doing peer-reviewed studies to try and prove the point that they're trying to make, when real science really should be about trying to disconfirm what you think is true and actually seeking to say this actually doesn't work and prove, so rather than trying to prove that it's right. And the need for closure is a interesting one, and it's probably fitting that it's coming at the end of this presentation perhaps. The need for closure is when you feel like you just got to make a decision because you feel like it's hanging around, you've got to do something, right? Well, just be aware of that. That's probably one of the most important ones to think about. Are you making the decision because it's the right time to make it, or are you making it because you just want to get the monkey off your back? Now, there is a tool that we use all the time, which I believe is basically the monkey on your back tool. I call it the monkey distribution system. Can anyone, the only time I'm going to ask you a question in the audience, does anyone think of the tool we're using all the time that basically is prompting this need for closure constantly? You probably checked it a few times. Yeah, emails. So let's face it, how many times do you send an email off and it bounces right back to you and you say, why does it come right back to me? Because that person doesn't want that on their back, so they get rid of it, get need for closure. We're not actually trying to resolve the problem here, we're just trying to get the problem off my back for 24 hours so I can relax. So if you're in workshops or if you're in a sort of leadership discussion and you're trying to make a decision, just be mindful that there'll be a tendency for people to kind of want to wrap up the decision and get on with things. Just always be mindful and think, do I have to actually make the decision right now? Can it actually wait? Can I actually put up with the anxiety of having the decision hanging over my head for another 24 hours if it means I'll get a better outcome? So, just in summary, I've talked a little bit about the planning and purpose. So just remember those 2 broad areas. There was, are you trying to open up the discussion, or are you actually trying to funnel it down and make a decision? Again, both are needed, but think about that before you run a workshop. Are you wanting to have an open discussion? If so, then run it differently to than if you were to try and just simply make a decision. Think about the environment. It sounds like if someone came into the presentation now, they think I was doing something about global warming, especially with that photo. But thinking about the environment would be simply just think about the room you're running it in. Don't invest a whole heap of time in people in the room, getting 20 people in the room and maybe even paying for a facilitator and doing all this planning and then shove everyone into the sort of the stuffiest room in the corner. Yeah, fair enough, you don't always have a lot of control over where you have your workshop, but if you've got a choice, really think about that, plan where you want to have it. And in terms of the personality and motivation, there are lots of techniques I discussed today. I'm sure you can get a copy of the presentation. With just general rules of thumb, if you're running a workshop, think about the different people in the room and think about the different approaches you could take to maximise the value out of that room. And I thought I'd just throw in a quick plug. This is, my business is called Opposite. This is on the back of your card. Basically, one of the things we do is we help organisations simplify processes, procedures, structures, simplify the way we go about doing our work. We also do a lot of work in design, so we've attended many safety design workshops. I think probably between these 2 gentlemen here, they've probably attended maybe 100 in the last 2 years, maybe not that many. But we do a lot of work in design, but not just infrastructure design, but also workplace design. We do a lot of work with trying to engage that sticky problem, which is becoming more common, I think I've noticed lately, where people just kind of aren't feeling motivated at work, and people are really concerned about it. They're changing jobs more often, they're unhappy. We do a lot of work in that area as well, and we also look at sort of customised programs and initiatives going to generate creativity, creative thinking, which is not an area that anyone's really quite mastered yet, but it looks at how can we modify our environment to promote creativity. If you're interested, we're also running a 2-day workshop in human factors and user-centered design. So a lot of the things we talked about today will be looked at, but in a kind of obviously with the 2-day workshop, hopefully I'm following the principles I talked about today, but we'll be looking at it in a more methodical way, have tools and things you can actually use when you go back to work. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, sure. Any questions?
Probably take 2 or 3 before 7 o'clock.
I've got a question here. At the very beginning, you put your planning and the purpose and outlining. How do you make a judgment after the event about how well you fulfilled those assessments?
That's a very good question. Well, you can do the traditional approach, which would be to go up to people afterwards and get them to rate. So give them a handout or something.
But normally your customer would be a management who's employed you.
Yes.
So
not in every case, but I certainly. Actually, recently I was actually on a teleconference, and it wasn't my client, but it was someone who was facilitating the session over a teleconference. Actually asked at the end, which surprised me. He said, what would you give the rate? How would you rate this meeting out of 10? I've never heard anyone just sort of come up with something like that. I thought it was pretty good for him to do it. Everyone kind of said, about 7. Which, it's kind of sitting on the fence a little bit. But the danger with just asking people at the end, of course, is that most of the time people don't want to offend you, so they'll give you an inflated score. So in terms of how you reach the plan or the purpose, if you've achieved that, I'm not too sure exactly. I think...
I was just getting back to maybe the purpose.
Yeah.
Because you have the workshop to bring the people in the workshop to a certain level, and that's the purpose of the workshop.
Yes.
And you then have to make judgment of how well you've brought those people across.
Yes.
What your objectives are trying to achieve.
Yes, actually, actually now I think about it, probably the best example of a purpose in a workshop would be, and something we try and focus on a lot, is the output of the workshop itself. So very simply, you got people together. Usually there's some sort of tangible artifact at the end. It may not be in that workshop itself, but at some point. And if you've achieved that, you've reached that, then that would be an example of actually reaching it. But it probably doesn't tell you about how efficient it was or quality. That's something you could perhaps assess independently later.
Yeah, I think it's right. So if you're touring around the country and you're doing 20 workshops, you've got to know which ones have worked better than others.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, no, look, and to be honest with you, I think that that's something that with most facilitators, they probably do like hearing it, but it's a bit like confirmation bias. You probably like to, ask people because you want to hear people sort of pat you on the back. But I also think that good facilitators have a good sense from reading the room as to whether or not, first of all, they've got good engagement. So, and you can hear, people whispering and doing that kind of stuff. So you always know when you might have lost people, but I think so long as you've achieved that output at the end, that's the most important thing. But yeah, it's a good question. Closing the loop at the end.
You just mentioned the word teleconference.
Yes.
And this is something that is happening more and more in the workplace, particularly with global companies.
Yeah.
And I find when I participate in teleconferences, I just struggle because I can't see the people, I can't read their body language. You get distracted because you can actually do other work on your computer while you're listening, or you can even fall asleep. And no one will know.
Or you can just walk out of the room, can't you?
That's right. Do you have tips that you've talked about today that could be applied in that environment?
Yes, well, number one would be don't do it if you can avoid it, obvious. But certainly running a workshop in telepresence is not advised, and we have done that from time to time. always a challenge. If you really want to do it properly, it's like with everything, the planning, the purpose, you've got to go back and plan that really well. So you've got to think to yourself, get yourself in the shoes of the person who's going to be on the end of the phone and actually engage with them before you even approach the workshop, have a chat to them, send them the material to look at, and prompt them constantly. Almost prompt them more than anyone else, because it's so easy to forget there's a person hanging on the other end of the line. There is also some psychology behind that as well. You tend to generalise about people who are not present in front of you, so you tend to make more assumptions about them. So if, say, that person seems to have switched off, it'd be very easy to go, oh, yeah, that person's always been a little bit lazy, and as opposed to if they're in the room with you and you can actually see them and you see their body language, and it's like, no, they haven't switched off, they're just listening intently. So also be mindful of the kind of assumptions you might make about people. But yeah, certainly I think rule number one is if you can avoid teleconference, do so, because yeah, it's terrible.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to say thank you. A bit of inspiration there.
I'm actually from Monash University, so
there you go.
There you go.
Emma must have known. Alright. So, cool. Huh?
We want to know what he got.
Oh,
There you go. John Monash. I think they're war letters of General Monash. So.
oh, nice, thank you.
There you go. Okay, so thank you very much for coming. Our next event on next month sometime, we get some pamphlets. I think that's the national one, isn't it?
Yep, you're speaking.
27th of November is the next one. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.